Hi, everyone, and welcome to Thursday's podcast. Why some COVID-19 patients crash. The body's immune system might be to blame, parentheses, cytokine storms, or cytokine, I don't know which. This is a piece by Geoff Bromfield at NPR of all websites. I hardly ever post anything from NPR. He reports it's a strange and tragic pattern in some cases of COVID-19. The patient struggles through the first week of illness and perhaps even feels a little better. Then suddenly they crash. We've seen some patients rapidly worsen, says Dr. Pavon. Yeah, that's right. Dr. Pavon? You know him or her. I'm not sure which. Dr. Pavon Bhattacharjee, an assistant professor at University of Washington who works in the intensive care unit at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Quote, yes, that's right, folks. He says, or she says, they initially were just requiring a little bit of oxygen. In 24 hours, they're on a ventilator. A recent study by Bhattacharjee and others found that the patient's lungs appeared to deteriorate quickly. The crash typically happens into the disease and can occur in young, otherwise healthy victims of COVID-19. Now doctors and researchers are increasingly convinced that in some cases, at least, the cause is the body's own immune system overreacting to the virus. The problem, known broadly as cytokine storm, can happen when the immune system triggers a runaway response that causes more damage to its own cells than to the invader it's trying to fight. Cytokines are a wide cast of small molecules in the body that are released by certain cells to help coordinate the battle against infection. Although there's limited data on how the release of too many of these molecules, the cytokine storm, affects COVID-19 patients, some doctors are already treating people who have the disease with powerful anti-inflammatory drugs to try and slow or stop the process. Anecdotally, they say the approach appears to be helping. The impact was dramatic, says Dr. Daniel Griffin, Chief of Infectious Disease for ProHealth Care Associates, a group of physicians that serves the New York City area. The first 6 patients he treated all appear to be improving, at least for now. He says, quote, yesterday was a good day, unquote. But other researchers caution that the untested treatments carry significant risks. Suppressing the body's immune system at the exact moment it's trying to fight off the deadly coronavirus could have all sorts of unintended consequences, warns Dr. Tobias Hohl, H-O-H-L, the chief of infectious disease at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. The infection could get worse, Hohl says. Nevertheless, Hohl and others believe that controlling cytokine storms or cytokine storms will turn out to be a critical way to help at least some of the sickest COVID-19 patients. And clinical trials are already underway in New York and elsewhere that could soon provide data about how existing drugs should be used. Quote, I think a month or two we're going to be able to help patients with COVID-19 who are dying from cytokine storms and potentially bring the mortality rate down, says Dr. Randy Cron, C-R-O-N, an immunologist at University of Alabama at Birmingham. The body's immune system is at the moment the most effective weapon people have against COVID-19. The majority of patients can cure themselves of the disease simply by resting at home, enabling a small army of their own cells to attack the infection. Those cells make it harder for the virus to replicate and help to develop antibodies that prevent it from infecting new cells. Those antibodies also likely help provide some protection against reinfection by the COVID-19 virus further down the road. But the army of the immune system can also do collateral damage. Jessica Hammerman, an immunologist at Benaroya Research Institute in Seattle, As she explains, when immune cells try to fight an infection, they make a lot of toxic molecules, and those toxic molecules can cause a lot of tissue damage, unquote. The results are familiar to many people who've had the flu. Aches, fever, and inflammation are actually symptoms of the immune system attack, not of the influenza virus itself. Cytokine storms occur when the immune system gets stuck trying to fight a disease, Hammerman says. Cytokine molecules summon various immune cells to swoop in and attack an infection. Normally, they turn on only briefly, then shut off when help arrives. But when a storm occurs, they keep sending the alarm long after it's needed. Think about it like when the smoke alarm never goes off. You're going to keep calling the firefighters over and over again, and you're going to have too many there, Hammerman says. Cytokine storms can be brought on by various illnesses. And when I catch my piece here, some are caused by a genetic condition known as primary HLH. Bacterial infections, such as those that lead to sepsis, can also sometimes trigger a storm. And the virus that caused the 1918 flu pandemic is thought to have led to deadly cytokine storms in many of the outbreak's otherwise young and healthy victims. Exactly why or how COVID-19 would do the same remains unclear, but data out of China and Europe suggest that patients have elevated levels of cytokines and other immune molecules that are associated with these storms. It's possible that the cytokine storm is being triggered because the virus is continuing to replicate despite the immune response, says Marion Pepper, an immunologist at the University of Washington. But it's also possible that the immune system is out of whack and continuing to call for help after the infection has died down. Quote, I don't know that they know whether it's one or the other, Pepper says. Regardless, Hammerman says the storm theory could explain the second-week crash. Quote, it may be that you need to wait until actually there's a sufficient immune response going on that can drive this cytokine storm. Some of the body's most powerful immune cells, known as T cells, take about a week to build up in the body. As they do, patients could start to improve and then rapidly worsen as the cells continue to proliferate beyond the point at which they are helpful. There are already drugs that can help reduce these storms, Hull says. Many are used to fight diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, where the body accidentally attacks its own cells. The drugs can block specific cytokines, effectively turning off the smoke detector, or they can more broadly blunt the immune response. One class of drugs in particular shows some anecdotal evidence of helping, known as interleukin-6 inhibitors, or IL-6 inhibitors. They block a specific cytokine associated with inflammation. Case reports out of France and China seem to show the patients are helped by the drugs, and Griffin says he's seen similar promise on the ground in the New York region where he's treating patients with both steroids and IL-6 inhibitors. Quote, it looks like if they get the interleukin-6 drug right as this cytokine storm is ramping up, the impact was dramatic, he says. In one case, a woman who was close to being put on a ventilator regained the ability to breathe on her own in a matter of hours. Another patient spent only a brief stint on a ventilator as opposed to the weeks typically required. As of Tuesday, he says he is treating dozens of patients with steroids and IL-6 inhibiting drugs. Now, I'm going to watch over the next few days, Dr. Griffin says. Is it durable? Will these people continue to do well? Excuse me. But Hole says that case reports and anecdotal evidence are not enough to recommend these drugs for everyone. For one thing, he says they have virtually no track record of being used while a patient is battling an infection. These drugs are phenomenally effective for rheumatologic conditions, he says, but blocking the immune system's communications network as the coronavirus mounts an attack could have unintended consequences. For example, IL-6 is important to stimulate the production of antibodies, Dr. Hole says. It also stimulates the production of T cells that can fight infection. Other drugs that act even more broadly in the body, such as corticosteroids, could also raise the risk of a secondary infection, he warns. Bacterial or fungal diseases could end up making the patient sicker than COVID-19 itself. Hammerman adds that cytokine storms are almost certainly not the only way COVID-19 kills its victims. The people who die from COVID-19, she says, are probably dying from many different causes. More data is needed to determine how often a cytokine storm is the cause of a patient's sudden illness and when the drugs should be administered. It's not going to help the 85-year-old with hypertension, that's high blood pressure, and diabetes, Dr. Krohn agrees. But for those who don't have chronic underlying diseases, and even for some of those who do, it will potentially help them, unquote. Clinical trials are now underway to test IL-6 inhibitors and other drugs against cytokine storms. Regeneron, one of the companies that makes IL-6 drugs, says that they are conducting clinical trials in the U.S. and Europe. We expect to be able to share initial results on the phase 2 portion of the U.S. trial by the end of April. That's this month, says Sarah Cornhill, a company spokesman. Roche, which also produces another IL-6 inhibitor, is in phase 3 trials. Both companies say they are increasing production of IL-6 inhibitors to cope with the anticipated demand for the drug. Hole says clinical trials have not yet opened at Memorial Sloan Kettering. In the meantime, he says he's already giving anti-inflammatory drugs to patients on a case-by-case basis. He is hopeful that within a matter of months, researchers will know far more about when and how these drugs might be useful in treating some COVID-19 patients. Quote, "We're using these drugs, but we're driving blind," he says. "What I hope is that a landscape will emerge and we'll see where the road is," unquote. I just thought, as long as that is a terrific, informative article over at NPR, and I salute Jeff Broomfield. Just an excellent article. And one more article. New York has 12 times more deaths than California because the state of New York, including Mayor de Blasio, was slow to react to the pandemic, laid on lockdown rules, and advised residents to, quote, "go on with their lives," experts say. It's my version of a title by Rachel Sharp over at the Daily Mail. This was from yesterday. She reports New York has more than 12 times the number of coronavirus deaths than California because the state was slow to react to the pandemic, laid on lockdown rules, and had advised residents to go on with their lives as the outbreak began to ramp up, according to experts. New York State continues to be ravaged by the pandemic, recording its deadliest 24 hours when 779 died. The total death toll across the state now sits at 6,268, more than double the number of people who died on 9/11, while confirmed cases reached 149,316. In California, 17,625 people have been infected and 453 have died by the virus. The number of deaths in the last 24 hours in New York is almost double California's total death toll since its first death on March 4th. Experts have pointed to marked similarities between the two states, but stark differences in handling of the outbreak, blaming This for New York's overwhelming loss of life. California was one of the first states to record cases of the killer virus as the pandemic reached U.S. soil, and it recorded its first death on March 4th. It was the first to report a case of possible community transmission on February 26th. The state, that's California, also has the biggest population of all 50 states, meaning numbers are likely to be higher than less populated states. However, New York City is the most densely populated city in the U.S., so people are packed in closer together and are therefore more at risk of contracting the virus from each other. New York reported its first community transmission case on March 3rd and its first death on March 14th. Questions are now being asked around why New York and not California has found itself as the epicenter of the U.S. crisis and has a drastically higher death toll despite being less time into the crisis. Experts have suggested that because California was quicker to react to the first cases, quicker to issue stay-at-home orders, the state has saved many lives. Krutika Kupali, an infectious disease physician and biosecurity fellow at Johns Hopkins, told Vox that California's proactive response is crucial in a pandemic. Quote, "We need to shift to a proactive mentality rather than reactive," she said, adding that reactive mentality has been very much the way this outbreak has been from the beginning. She says, anytime you are dealing with an outbreak, it appears like you overreacted, then you probably did the right thing. California went into lockdown several days before New York, and several experts have highlighted the difference a few days can make in slowing the spread. San Francisco Mayor London Breed, declared a local state of emergency on February 25th. Then on March 16th, the San Francisco Bay Area became the first in the U.S. to issue a shelter-in-place order before California Governor Newsom issued a statewide stay-at-home order 3 days later on March 19th. New York issued a statewide stay-at-home on March 22nd, 3 days after California's. Advice and messaging from officials leading up to the lockdowns in the states was also widely different, meaning New Yorkers were slower than California to change their habits. New York City Mayor de Blasio adopted a business-as-usual approach right up to the moment the city shut down, telling New Yorkers to, quote, go on with your lives, unquote. On March 2nd, he tweeted that he was encouraging New Yorkers to go on with your lives and get out on the town despite coronavirus, unquote. That same day, Breed told San Franciscans to prepare for a possible disruption from an outbreak and mentioned shutting schools and businesses. The polarized messaging seems to have impacted behaviors of residents, with open table data on seated restaurant dining down 18% in San Francisco on March 1st, but just 2% down in New York City, Vox reported. Jen Cates, Director of Global Health and HIV Policy at Kaiser Family Foundation, told Vox that a matter of days is critical in the early days of a health crisis, when cases can escalate rapidly if no action is taken. With this virus, days and even hours matter, she said. A quick response is also essential because as soon as one case is identified, it is likely that there have already been far broader outbreak, said George Rutherford, an epidemiologist at the UCSF Hospital, told Vox. Your chance of the first case being the one that comes to your attention is very, very, very small, he said. Lack of testing in the early stages of the U.S. crisis and the virus often taking several days for symptoms to arise and worsen meant the nation was already on the back burner when it came to decisive action, Rutherford explained. So a delay in issuing a stay-at-home order could have been particularly costly for New Yorkers. By the time you have the first death, you have to figure that there has been 3 full weeks of transmission, and there are at least several hundred cases in the population, he told Fox. New York has also come under fire from Donald Trump for getting off to a late start in fighting coronavirus. The president said in a press conference a press briefing last month that the state had been too slow to act while he came out in praise of California and Washington state's responses. For whatever reason, New York got off to a late start, and you see what happens when you get off to a late start, said Trump on March 31st, adding that New Jersey was similar to slow. New Jersey got off to, and I think both governors are doing an excellent job, but they got off to a very late start, unquote, said Trump. He went on to praise Washington and California states for their response. If you look at Washington state, if you remember that all started in a very confined nursing home, said Trump, and if you had 20-odd people dying in that one home, but it didn't mean that it had escaped that home, which means they have a very different statistic to other states. Dr. Birx, the White House coronavirus response coordinator, who stands behind Trump in these press briefings, reinforced the president's views, saying that she recommended other infected cities and states look to California and Washington for inspiration on and how to respond to the pandemic, and not New York. California and Washington state reacted very early to all of this. Washington state had some of the earliest infections. They have kept it low and steady. Other areas should work more like California than the New York metro area, she added. Washington state, about 2 weeks before New York or New Jersey, California is a week before New York or New Jersey, really talked to their communities and decided to mitigate before they started seeing this number, Birx said. Authorities have warned of the similarities between the actions taken by Philadelphia and St. Louis during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and the different approaches taken by very different states amid the pandemic. Around 100 million people died worldwide from the 1918 flu, with around 675,000 deaths in the U.S. The parts of the U.S. that acted quickly to roll out social distancing measures recorded far fewer deaths than cities slow to act, according to a 2007 study in PNAS. In 1918, when World War I was coming to a close, U.S. cities held Liberty Loan parades, bringing in thousands of revelers. When the Spanish flu pandemic ramped up, St. Louis canceled its parade, but Philadelphia decided to plow on with its celebration in the city of 1.7 million people. The parade took place on September 28th with 200,000 people in attendance. 3 days later, just 3 days later, there were 635 new cases in Philadelphia, and every bed in the city's hospitals was filled, according to UPenn, that's University of Pennsylvania. 6 weeks later, 12,000 people had died, and there were 47,000 cases. By the end of the pandemic, at least 16,000 had died in Philadelphia, and more than 500,000 had fallen ill. By contrast, St. Louis's death toll reached 700. The CDC's Division of Global Mitigation and Quarantine said this deadly example shows the benefit of canceling mass gatherings and employing social distancing measures during pandemics. However, experts have cautioned that California could still be headed for a disaster if it reopens the state for business too soon. Experts are advising that even if the curve is flattening in states and death and infection tolls decline, it is critical to continue social distancing for several more weeks and even months for the risk of a new outbreak to be averted. St. Louis made this mistake during the Spanish flu epidemic, lifting social distancing measures to see a renewed spike in deaths, according to a 2007 study in JAMA. LA officials, that's Los Angeles officials, have warned residents not to become complacent as the state appears to be on the road to recovery, with LA County Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer telling people to stay home and avoid grocery stores if they can help it. Without everyone taking every possible precaution, she says our numbers can start skyrocketing. Jeffrey Martin, an epidemiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, said that more testing is needed to bring the pandemic under control until a vaccine is developed. There's enough testing around, and people are willing to be tested. The brush fires can be identified and put out before the wildfire starts. The only way that a society can function is if the brush fires are identified. And put out. The U.S. has long been plagued by shortages of test kits, but testing will be crucial to reopening the economy, Martin said. Dr. Robert Bollinger of Johns Hopkins University issued a similar warning in an interview with CNBC Tuesday. The U.S. economy cannot restart until testing and contact tracing for the killer disease improves. Rapid testing, contact tracing, and continuing with social distancing efforts will truly allow us to move the economy forward to get back to work, he said. South Korea has rolled out thousands of tests and seems to have quickly brought its outbreak under control. Some U.S. states are turning to similar measures of contact tracing and increased testing. On Tuesday, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker announced the launch of COVID-19 Community Tracing Collaborative initiative, which focuses on tracing the contacts of confirmed positive COVID-19 patients. In Maryland, Governor Larry Hogan announced a similar measure with the creation of strike teams that will provide immediate support to nursing homes struck by the outbreak. Part of this includes increased testing to separate exposed residents and staff and healthy staff to limit the spread. The U.S. death toll continues to surge. Okay, so that concludes the two stories and the reports. I mean, and they're just amazing, the amount of news that we're getting now, and hopefully it will help us eradicate this scourge on the nation. I'm Dave Levine. See you tomorrow.